Well, here we are again. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Wednesday or whatever day you happen to be watching this on. Today we're talking about science, expertise, and politics, and how we arrived as a society uh, at a place where many of us have a basic knee-jerk allergic reaction to science and to scientists. And many of us basically don't trust them. That to me, and of course I have to own my biases in this particular circumstance. I am a social scientist. I am a scientist in no uncertain terms. So I have a little skin in the game when it comes to what people think of scientists. But it's still crazy. It's crazy to me that these are the people, scientists, and science, the thing that we produce. These are the people whose job it is to, in the most objective and value neutral way possible, generate knowledge, new knowledge. This is an inherently apolitical activity. It is as inherently apolitical as any activity, economic activity, productive, creative activity could be. It is the productive activity in the world that is the most intentionally set up to be honest, transparent, and apolitical. And yet, science has become a political touchstone. Science has become deeply politicized. And this has led us to a very real situation in the United States and in other parts of the world in 2020, where people are dying because they don't believe in science, where politicizing science is literally killing people. So this is abstract, and it is far, in some ways, from our daily lives, the politicization of science, but it has very real life and death, blood and bone and gristle implications that we got to pay attention to. So that's what we're going to do today, my friends. We're going to pay attention to science. Bow, bow, bow. Finger guns. All right. So the stuff we read today started with the proposition that climate denial, that is to say, the societal phenomenon whereby large swaths of the US population, and as I've read, large swaths of other countries' populations, but at smaller percentages, have arrived at the objectively, unequivocally wrong and stupid belief that climate change is either not real at all, or that it is real but not caused by human beings through our industrialized and advanced capitalist economic processes. A fancy word for this that you may hear and that you can learn from me and then whip out at parties and become the life of the party if, we can ever have parties again. The word is anthropogenic. Say it along with me. Anthropogenic. Anthropogenic. It means man-made, except without having to use the word man to mean all of people, because lots of people, probably more than half of them, are not men. So person-made, anthropogenic, caused by people, caused by human activity. So we live in a place and in a time where the the scientists, the experts, the people that study this shit for a living, the people whose like whole job description has been, over centuries, engineered to ensure, to the extent possible, transparency, honesty, veracity, objectivity. These are the people that have become politically divisive, and big chunks of our population have decided to ignore what they say, to disbelieve what they say, to be skeptical, to deny what scientists say around climate change. And we'll talk a little bit about exactly how that came to pass. How it came to pass that the United States is the country that has, depending on how you count it, I've seen different numbers. I've seen U.S. has the most climate deniers out of any country in the world, or U.S. is number 3 after like Saudi Arabia and Indonesia out of any country in the world. So it's either the country in the world with the most climate deniers, or it's the rich country in the world with the most climate deniers, or the quote-unquote developed country in the world with the most climate deniers. But either way, we got a lot of climate deniers relative to our population in comparison to other countries. So the story that is relevant for COVID-19 is also got a lot of people out there that are COVID deniers. Various shades of COVID denial exist, from the sort of really radical far right, this is a hoax by the fake news media to damage Trump in his re-election bid, to the more moderate center right that says, well, it exists, it's a disease, but it's not worth closing the economy down for. It's like the flu. Most people don't get all that sick at all. No biggie. So different shades of denial, but there are parallels between climate denial and COVID denial. There are parallels between the anti-climate change movement and the protests against masking, the protests against the so-called lockdowns, etc. And so I want to pose this to you as a question. I don't purport to have all of the answers, but I want to pose this to you as a question, something for you to think about over the course of this conversation, this admittedly very one-way conversation that we're having right now. Has climate denial created a space, created a set of structures, put a set of structures in place that allowed for, that facilitated the emergence of COVID denial? That's a question, an open question that I pose to you. So I want to talk a little bit about science over the 20th century. It's got a weird history, it's science. But we used to think that scientists were the shit. I mean, we used to be really, really like excited about our scientists. We used to be very grateful to them, when, scientists came up with like the polio vaccine, for example. Antibiotics were discovered or something. I mean, we were pretty excited about these things, right? So I guess let's start here by making a distinction between, and these are inadequate terms to describe what I'm talking about. So we'll use scare quotes around a lot of it, but pure science versus applied science. And so pure science is knowledge for the sake of knowledge, to put it simply. Whereas applied science is taking that knowledge and using it in a way to either create something that has an effect on our lives, whether that be a policy, a law, whether it be a piece of technology, whether it be a medical innovation. So there's applied science and there's pure science, and these two different things have different the critiques and the attacks take different forms and different kinds of politicization depending on what the science is. And so early 20th century, you've got Frederick Winslow Taylor, and you can Google him if you want, if you feel like you want to go down a little research rabbit hole. Frederick Winslow Taylor wrote this book called The Principles of Scientific Management, and it gave rise to this whole phenomenon called Taylorism that might be best exemplified by the assembly line, the sort of Henry T. Ford, Henry T. Ford, Model T. Ford, Henry Ford, Model T. You know what I'm saying, Henry T. Ford. Maybe his middle initial is T. I don't know. Look it up and tell me. Let's do the thing we did last time again. 1 extra credit point for anyone that emails me Henry Ford's middle name, and if it starts with a T, I don't know, but everybody's going to be excited. Henry T. Ford. Something. I was saying stuff. You know what I mean. So Frederick Winslow Taylor, Principles of Scientific Management. Here we are applying essentially models of efficiency to commodity production, right? So this is when science begins its rise over the 20th century to become something that by the middle of the 20th century, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any American who didn't think that scientists and experts were excellent people, were laudable public servants, were people to be appreciated, to be exalted. So the 20th century, particularly the first half and sort of culminating in the middle of the 20th century, was a period of great admiration for science and scientists. This is often referred to as high modernism, sometimes referred to derogatorily as high modernism, as a lot of times it had a sort of paternalistic quality to it, because people were so enamored of science and enamored with scientists that scientists and experts, technical experts, would adopt a sort of paternalistic attitude, like an I know better than you kind of an attitude, or like a here's how I'm going to fix your problems, little person kind of an attitude. And so that did generate some resentment. And then also in the middle of the 20th century, you've got this phenomenon that to our way of thinking maybe in 2020 seems quaint or weird or unexpected, which is critiques of applied science, but not from the right end of the political spectrum, but from the lefter, the more lefty, more progressive end of the political spectrum. And so, and these manifest in some ways as critiques of high modernism. So we've talked, I think, about Jane Jacobs in this class and her critiques of urban renewal approaches, which are sort of high modern approaches to urban design and planning. But then you also have things like the publication of Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, in which she discovers and makes the world aware for the first time ever that DDT and agricultural chemicals were had a negative effect on the environment, right? Up until that time, early 1960s, we thought bombing agricultural products, bombing farms with chemical fertilizers and pesticides was an unequivocal good to the world, that the only thing it would accomplish was growing more, bigger food. And Rachel Carson was the first one to say, actually you're killing bugs and you're killing birds, and that's hence the title of the book Silent Spring, because you kill all the songbirds, then when spring comes around, there won't be any out there singing or whistling, and you'll have a silent spring. So these were critiques of applied science. And they were critiques of applied science that came from the political left, one might say, although you could also argue, I think, that Rachel Carson was not a political figure in any way, but these were perspectives, these were arguments that followed what came to be called the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle very simply says, if the application of a particular scientific discovery has risks that are unknown, then we must not apply that scientific discovery until we know the risks. Okay, so this has been used a lot, for example, in banning genetically modified organisms in food, right? So genetically modified corn and wheat and soy and these sorts of things that in the US we consume quite a bit of, that are not required to be labeled on boxes in nutrition facts or whatever, nutrition labels. In Europe, for example, in the European Union, anything that's GMO, that's genetically modified, has to be labeled as such. And generally speaking, they apply the precautionary principle to GMO seeds and organisms and other sorts of things. And so the argument goes, well, we don't really know. I mean, as far as we know, there isn't like a particular harm, but we don't actually know for a fact that this isn't going to harm us, that it's not going to produce a disproportionate risk. And so we're not going to do it, right? Until such time as we know that it's not going to harm us, we're not going to do it. Or until such time as we understand the harms, I think is maybe a better way to say it. Until such time as we understand and can sort of do a calculus of the cost-benefit analysis of the harms versus the gains, we're going to not adopt it. That's the precautionary principle. And it's a principle that's predicated on the avoidance of risk. In the face of uncertainty, in the face of unknowns, avoid the risk. The critiques of science that come from the other side of the political spectrum, from the right side of the political spectrum, that also date to around the middle of the 20th century, aren't critiques that come from a precautionary principle perspective. Say that 3 times fast. They are critiques that, instead of aiming to avoid risk, are actually aiming to obscure risk, to ignore or to cloud the possibility of risk. So they are critiques of applied science in some similar ways, but they aim to accomplish something very different. And so, for example, we read about the in the 1950s, there was research that started to show that smog in Los Angeles came from automobile emissions, which of course had the potential to negatively impact the fuel industry, the oil industry. And so the oil industry began to undertake research that was designed to sow doubt about the connection between automobile emissions and smog in LA. And in the reading that we did, they referred to this as a test run for, in the 1990s and beyond, the fossil fuel industry's assault on climate science. So the main thing I want you to take away from this is that to summarize, throughout the 20th century, almost everybody in the United States thought scientists were the bee's knees. The dubiousness of science, the skepticism, and the sort of populist assault on science did not really begin in earnest until the turn of the 21st century. Two, since about the 1950s, there have been politicized critiques of science, both from the left and the right, but with very different objectives. Critiques from the left apply the precautionary principle and aim to avoid undue risk. Critiques from the right do not apply the precautionary principle and aim to obscure or cloud or hide risk. So you've heard of this phrase. There's probably a million shitty TV and pulp novel thrillers called Burden of Proof. So you've heard the phrase burden of proof. It's a legal term. It doesn't really apply here, but it kind of is good for thinking about what I am asking you to think about. So in legal terms, burden of proof means if you bring a complaint, if you file a complaint, if you file a grievance, if you file a lawsuit, if you sue somebody, if you are the plaintiff in any kind of circumstance like that, then the burden is on you. That is to say, the responsibility falls to you to prove the claim, right? So in science, unlike the law, because we have a different standard in science than they have in the law, we can't really prove much. But that doesn't mean we don't know shit. Proof is an almost unreasonably unattainable standard. We don't traffic in proof. The scientific method is based on probabilities, not certainty. And so we can tell you with some amount of probability that this thing is likely to happen, with some amount of probability that this thing causes that thing, but we cannot statistically be certain in science of much. But if there is a consensus, a scientific consensus, a broad scientific consensus among a vast majority of scientists across the entire world that a thing is what it is, that's as close to proof as we can ever get and should be considered essentially proof. So the thing is, the fact that we traffic in probability rather than proof is not evidence of our inadequacy as a way of thinking or a way of knowing or a way of figuring stuff out. It is just the opposite. The fact that we can't prove it is evidence of our transparency, of our veracity, of our honesty. But it also creates a window. The fact that we have to stop short of making definitive, absolute, unequivocal claims about things opens a window for the possibility of doubt. And you know, you've seen like those like spreaders things that you stick in, and then that's what science denial does. Is it gets into that little tiny, narrow, almost microscopic window between probable and certain, and it just starts stretching it and poking at it until that window grows. And the window doesn't actually grow for us, but it grows for the population as doubt is sown and introduced into popular discourse. So, but you know, the thing is that all of the onus, even though we don't have a burden of proof, all of the onus for making arguments on behalf of something falls to the scientist, whereas the science denier only has to introduce doubt. And it doesn't even have to be a big doubt, but it just introduce enough doubt to throw into question the legitimacy of the science. That is a lot easier to do than to make a scientific claim. It's a lot easier to, basically, let's put it like this. It's a lot easier for somebody to shit on your idea than it is for you to come up with that idea to begin with, right? So like, picture this. I don't know what you do. Let's say you paint, or no, let's say you play guitar and you compose a song and you're really excited and you work a long time on the song and you work it and rework it and add some lyrics, and it's a good song and it's meaningful to you and you're really proud of it. And then like your friend comes over and you play the song for them and they're like, it's not very good. It's, you know, it's derivative, it's trite, meh. That was really easy for that person to do. It took 2 seconds, it took no creative energy whatsoever, and it completely shits on this thing that you've built, this beautiful expression of yourself that you built, right? Which took a long time, which took a lot of effort and a lot of energy and a lot of investment, right? And that's kind of, I mean, that's maybe a weird analogy, but that's kind of what we've got here with science versus science deniers. It's really time-consuming, labor-intensive to do this creative work of producing knowledge, of figuring shit out. We invest a lot of ourselves in it. And then a Rush Limbaugh, all they have to do is come along and say, that's no good. It's not definitive. We don't know that's true. And then it's over. So, so in other words, the two teams don't have the same level of responsibility, don't have the same burden of effort. So another piece of this that I want to suggest here is I want to offer a distinction between fake news and fake science. Fake news is a phrase that we hear a lot these days It's a pretty new phrase in the popular lexicon, but it's a big one. But it's also bullshit. There is no such thing as fake news, and here's why. If misinformation or disinformation tricks you, that's your fault. Because you, as a citizen, as an engaged, and I don't mean citizen like here are my papers. I mean citizen like a participant in our democracy, right? You, as an engaged member of our society, as a participant in our democracy, as a human being, you are obligated, you must be clever enough to figure out when they're lying to you. You must not allow them to lie to you. The onus is on you for that, because that's news media, it's journalism, it's popular, it's not specialized, and it's for you. It's written for you to consume. And so you have an obligation to read the news critically. You have an obligation. If something looks weird, if it's not totally convincing, look it up on multiple sources, find the data, fact check it, go to a fact checking website. It's up to you to sort through the noise when it comes to consuming the news. That's why there cannot be fake news. There can be news, there can be it's not news. If it's fake, it's not news. First of all, it's misinformation. There can be misinformation. You can get misinformation or disinformation from even reputable, in scare quotes, sources. But if you let it fake you out, that's on you. You see what I'm saying? But science is different. Science is not written for quote-unquote lay people. Science is written for specialists. And so you, as people that do not have PhDs in, microbiology or something, you're not under any obligation to be able to tell if a scientific article is good or not. You are under an obligation to be able to tell if a news article is good or not, but you are not under any obligation to be able to tell if a scientific article is good or not. That's what science is supposed to do for you. That's why it exists. That's why there are scientists, specialists, experts that can talk to one another. And so when a political donor group creates a research institute, and those big donors, let's say Republican donors, billionaires, with particular political agendas, create a research institute, and that research institute begins to generate contrarian research that seeks to poke holes in climate science, for example. You shouldn't have to figure out for yourself whether that's bona fide science or not. And that is what makes it fake, because it uses the trappings of science. It looks like science, it talks like science, but it's lies. or if it's not lies, it's misinformation, because it flies in the face of an overwhelming consensus among apolitical scientists, and because it's funded, it's underwritten by billionaires with political agendas. Okay, so here's the playbook for climate denial, which has also become the playbook for COVID denial. And you'll see that, many of these are things that we see in the president's press conferences every day. First of all, there are civil servant scientists employed by the federal government. Got to make sure you ignore them. It's convenient to blame China for things, right? So, China's emissions, its industrialization, its very rapid urbanization, that's the reason why we've got climate change. It's not on us. Or that's the reason why we've got COVID. It's not on us, right? You attack and you smear scientists, right? Ad hominem personal attacks against scientists. They're hypocrites, they're bad people, they are cheating. They've cooked the data to try to make a particular point to fit their political worldview. You employ populist framing. You cast scientists as elitists, as out of touch, as coastal elites, as rich, as liberal. You say things, for example, like, I'm not afraid of COVID-19 because that's only in New York City, right? You dismiss the seriousness of the threat, right? Okay, so yeah, there is some extra carbon in the atmosphere. Hey, it's just going to fertilize the plants and we'll have more zucchini. Bigger zucchinis. Climate change equals bigger zucchinis. Boom. You're welcome. So you can dismiss the seriousness of the threat like that. You can dismiss the seriousness of the threat in the same way with COVID. It's just the flu. I mean, yeah, there's some people that are getting sick, but nobody in my neighborhood's getting sick. I don't know anybody that's getting sick. I don't know why you're shutting my business down. It's just the flu. Come on, man. Don't be a wuss. And then again, what we talked about with the uncertainty, exploiting, capitalizing on that little bit of uncertainty, right? The fact that science can't offer definitive proof in many instances. So this quote, I want to share with you this quote. It's a famous quote from a cigarette manufacturer from an internal tobacco industry memo that was published, and it says, so this is a tobacco industry person, and he says, or they say, doubt is our product, since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy. So that's like that person in that moment said the thing out loud that you're not supposed to say out loud. Basically, look, the body of fact, read that as the consensus among 90% of the world's scientists, is that anthropogenic climate change is an existential threat to humanity in the next 100 years. That's the body of fact. So what we want to do to compete with the body of fact is to sow doubt. Doubt is our product. It allows us to compete with the body of fact, and it also establishes a controversy, right? So in other words, it gives us a platform to say, well, there are actually 2 points of view on this. There's a debate, an unresolved debate. And that's how it's done. Of course, another of the big moves in the playbook is to create institutions, to endow, to fund institutions that sow doubt. And there's a wonderful book that for your summer nightstand or beach, socially distant beach reading, you should check out, called Dark Money, by a New Yorker, staff writer called Jane Mayer. Dark Money. And in that book, Mayer traces the very elaborate network of right-wing billionaires that harness their money to influence politics and policy. And they do this by obviously funding campaigns, but they also do it more insidiously by creating lobbying organizations, nonprofits, think tanks, and even departments, academic departments on campuses. So for example, George Mason University in Northern Virginia has a famously conservative Department of Economics. Well, the Koch brothers, among other billionaire libertarian and far-right activists, have funneled lots and lots of money into the economics department at George Mason University. So it cannot be definitively proven that that funding has influenced the arguments and the findings of that set of economists, but I would like to sow some doubt. I'd like to raise the question. There may be a relationship. So you can do that. If you're a right-wing billionaire, you can. I suppose you could do it if you're a left-wing billionaire too, although most don't, but some do, to be honest. But you can create these think tanks, to churn out, full of PhDs, to churn out, science, peer-reviewed in some cases and non-peer-reviewed in others, that questions the consensus, that sows doubt, that creates the illusion of a debate among scientists around an issue when in fact there is none or very little. Another good technique is to blame government overreach. We've seen this with climate denial. Who's the government to tell me how much, what kind of emission standards I can have on my car or on my factory? It's my car. It's my factory. I decide. Who's the government to tell me that I've got to pay more for carbon offsets? Who's the government to incentivize me to buy an electric vehicle with a tax credit? So we can blame government overreach. We can also blame government overreach in the case of COVID, right? You fucking kidding me? Pritzker? You're shutting down my restaurant? My bar? My music venue? My movie theater? On what authority do you have to do that? It's my thing. I created it. I built it from the ground up. I own it. I decide, right? You can't steal my livelihood from me on a whim like that and just wave your magic wand and shut down my enterprise, steal my livelihood, take food out of my children's mouths. You can't do that. Well, depends on how you want to look at things, whether they can do it or not. And it depends on how you want to look at things, whether that's a good thing or not. I would suggest that they can, in fact, do it, and that is a good thing. because it sucks terribly for people. And I've had students and friends who are whose families are entrepreneurs that have lost everything in the last 3 months. And that is not obviously something that any of us want. But we're also talking about saving millions and millions of lives. And that's pretty important too. So, so we can blame government overreach, and we can also reframe the debate to be one of, instead of about saving lives, to be about creating jobs. And so here's an easy, simple phrase that I made up that can help you kind of think about this set of issues. I call it the lives versus livelihoods debate. So on the one hand, you've got people arguing on behalf of lives, right? And so in climate change, that might look something like this. Well, we need to stop burning carbon because we're warming up the atmosphere. It's going to cause droughts. It's going to cause storms. It's going to cause flooding. It's going to make it untenably hot for all kinds of organisms. That's going to ramify through food chains. All of these things are going to kill millions and millions and millions of people in agonizing ways over the next 100 years. And all we have to do to save these millions and millions and millions of people is, shut down fossil fuel industries and stop international travel and put corks in all of the cows' asses, and we're good, right? Well, then everybody that depends on travel and fossil fuels and cow ass to survive, which is all of us, comes back and says, well, you can't, you take away my job, you take away the whole company, the whole sector of the economy that I depend on. You've taken away my livelihood. You've stolen the future of my children away from me. And that's a really compelling argument. And so it comes down to, in the popular imagination, a debate between lives on the one hand versus livelihoods on the other. And we see the same thing with COVID, right? If we all stay home, if we shut down travel, if we shut down hospitality, we can save lives. But on the other hand, now 20% of the country's unemployed, and that's real. Being unemployed, not good. Not being able to get food and pay your rent, not good. And let's not even talk about, being able to save for retirement or something like that. That's so far away from imaginable for such a large percentage of the people in this country. It's not even worth talking about. We're talking about, like, how can I get enough food and not die from malnutrition? Like, I'll worry about retirement when the time comes. So that's real, right? The livelihoods thing is real. But also the lives thing is real. And as we've talked about in this class, it's not just going to be lives, right? It's going to be disproportionately black and brown lives. It's going to be disproportionately queer lives, trans lives, poor lives. It's going to be disproportionately third world lives. It's going to be disproportionately immigrant lives. And so there's a real salient justice aspect to the story as well. And we can talk about the same debate, we can frame it the same way, lives versus livelihoods, if we want to talk about the idea of the university reopening in August, something I've given a lot of thought to in the past months. The university wants to reopen. A lot of us are thinking, I hear you, I get that, but you put 20-somethings in a classroom in a building with no windows, motherfuckers are going to get sick. some of y'all gonna die. But if we don't do that, if we don't put all of you in the fall in a classroom with shitty masks that you probably didn't wash or don't wear when you go to parties, and if we don't put you all in the classroom, hundreds of people that work here are going to lose their jobs. So how do you meet that out? How do you weigh that? How do you figure that? You got to figure it out somehow. How much money is that life worth? What's the dollar value on that life? No good answers, just questions. So on the subject of sowing doubt, because that's really I think the main technique, the main strategy here, because science, just because of the way science is set up, lends itself to this sowing of doubt. So this is a quote from the article that I had you read, so I'll just read the whole quote. Carol Muffett, aka Little Miss, just kidding, she's probably never heard that before. Carol Muffett, president of the Center for International Law, told Inside Climate News in a 2016 interview, quote, "You see the creation of an echo chamber of doubt that takes the small unknowns and uncertainties and magnifies it until all we have is unknowns, when in fact the actual science isn't that way at all." Right? And so she's talking about the process of introducing doubt. You start by just sprinkling a little bit of doubt, just a little spritz of uncertainty. I'm not completely convinced. And then there's an echo chamber that magnifies. And that echo chamber is right-wing media, social media, and it magnifies that little incremental bit of doubt until in the popular imaginary, all there is doubt. And so the actual science becomes obscured. The scientific consensus, the fact that the vast majority of the world's experts on this particular phenomenon agree, which should be the focus of any conversation. And to go back to our very first slide, if this were 1960, it would be the focus of every conversation. But it has now been obscured by this smoke screen, this cloud of doubt that has taken this tiny little microscopic element of uncertainty and spread it until all we see is a lack of consensus. So let's look at some graphity graphs. These are countries' attitudes on climate change as a major threat. And so you'll see the United States. I can highlight the United States for you with my powerful tools of highlighting. Right here. United States. Okay, so all of the countries above U.S. see climate change as more of a threat than the U.S. does, and all the countries below the U.S. see it as less of a threat. And so the countries that see it as less of a threat are oil-producing countries in some cases, Nigeria, for example, deeply conservative countries that are allied with the United States, like Israel, for example. And most of the countries above the U.S. are the wealthy countries, the countries of Western Europe, the robust democracies, the social democracies, and that sort of thing. So it gives you a sense of where we are among our peers in terms of our adherence to science, our respect for science, our faith in science. And then this graph here shows political polarization on climate change in the United States. And it's a weird graph. I don't understand. But you see that red, the red one here that says 17%, the one I just circled. That is the Republicans who have high science knowledge. So this is what I don't really get. If you're a Republican, the more scientific training you have, the less you believe in climate change. That's bugged out. Democrat, it's the exact opposite. The more scientific training you have, the more you believe in climate change. And the less scientific training you have, the less you believe in climate change, obviously. Which is that's the intuitive pattern, right? The Republican side for me anyway, is a counterintuitive pattern. But even setting aside, for example, the low, medium, and high scientific knowledge piece of this, you can just see the radical departure between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their agreement with this statement that human activity contributes a great deal to climate change. So this thing which is, let me say this for maybe the 16th time in this presentation, the vast majority, north of 90% of the world's climate scientists agree with this. Human activity contributes to a great deal to climate change, and agree that climate change is a very serious, if not the most serious, existential threat to human society. Over 90% of scientists agree with that. And yet, there's this incredible divide, political divide between Republicans and Democrats in the United States that you do not see nearly to the same extreme in other countries. So where do most climate deniers live? Well, the U.S. is among the highest countries in the world in terms of like percentage of climate deniers. And so the 6% of people in the U.S. say climate is not changing, and 9% say climate is changing, but humans are not responsible. Look at the other ones that are high. Saudi Arabia, which again has a huge oil industry. Norway, which is also actually quite dependent on fossil fuel production. So some interesting outcomes there, but the United States is the highest. So part of the point that these readings that we read for today made was climate change is real and climate change is deadly, but climate change doesn't have us right now in the middle of 2020 like trying to deal with bodies piling up and nowhere to go, like New York City has. Climate change isn't murdering tens and hundreds of thousands of people right now, at least not in an explicit way like COVID-19 is. And so one of the questions that the reading poses to itself that it doesn't actually answer, and so I'll in turn pose to you as something to think about, is does the time scale difference between COVID and climate change matter? The fact that climate change, although very real and very fucking scary, is a more gradual process. It plays out over the course of 100 years. COVID-19 plays out over the course of 1, maybe 2 years. we see right now, we can look, and every one of us has stories of people that we know who have died from this disease. So, does the immediacy of it, does the visual impact of it make it different in terms of the deniers? Can we convince the deniers because you can see it in a way that you can't see climate change? Climate change is like, when you live with somebody, you don't notice that they are looking different over time. When you see somebody every day, you don't notice. But if you look at a picture of somebody that you saw the last time you saw them was 10 years ago, you'd be like, holy shit, that person's changed, right? That's climate change. Whereas like COVID is like if you looked at the person that you saw every day and they all of a sudden looked like they were 10 years older. That's COVID. So that immediacy of the dramatic violence, does that change the way science denial works? It should, I think. It hasn't, I think. I think that we have denied the reality of these deaths. I think we've ignored it. I think we've said things like, well, it's not that bad right here where I am, or I don't know anybody, or, I do know people and they got really sick, but now they're feeling better. Or, they were sick with something else, or it was their fault, or, you know what I mean? There's a whole bunch of different ways that we can rationalize this to ourselves and continue to believe that it's safe for us to go around. It's safe for other people for us to go around not social distancing, not wearing masks, to continue to believe that it was an authoritarian government overreach to close sectors of the economy to save lives, right? These sorts of things. But I mean, this is real. So if you look at this table here, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an awful, dark moment in our history that took approximately 225,000 lives. The Holocaust, 6 million lives. And some more recent estimates are saying 10 million. 9/11, 3,000 lives. COVID-19, 412,000, 411,000, and that's just in 3 months. So if we assume that we're going to have, one, maybe two more outbreaks, we're looking at, I would say, 1,500,000 deaths, which is probably a reasonable, if not slightly conservative estimate. So let's compare this with other, oh man, my face, my beautiful, beautiful chiseled face is blocking all of the numbers, and I don't know how to fix that. Oh well, I can tell you what they are. I'm sorry, you're just gonna have to look at my beautiful face. Oh, hi everybody. Smallpox, 3,000 years, killed a lot of motherfuckers. 300 million to be more or less exact. Not quite exact, but approximate. The Black Death, which has the best name of any global pandemic, over 5 years, killed 225 million. Spanish flu, 1918, the one that we're familiar with, in 1 year, 50 million. That was some deadly shit. HIV AIDS, over 40 years, 44 million. Cholera, over 24 years, 1,500,000. Asian flu, Russian flu, Hong Kong flu, all around 1 million. Swine flu, 500,000 in a year. COVID-19, 3 months, 412,000. Okay, so multiply that by 4 to get your 1 year, and we're already looking at a number that puts us above Asian flu and below cholera, but below cholera that took 24 years to kill 1.5 million, and COVID-19 is probably only going to take 1 to 2 years to kill 1.5 million. So COVID-19 is nothing to fuck with, for the record. And I quote, my professor said, quote, COVID-19 ain't nothing to fuck with, end quote. That's what he said. So science is politicized, right? We just saw this with this climate change stuff, but we're seeing the same thing happen with COVID-19 denial, politicization of COVID-19 denial, just like we saw the politicization of climate denial. We're seeing red states that are Republican strongholds or run by Republican governors, taking fewer precautions, closing later, opening earlier, and you know, we see these rhetorical strategies like on the far right, calling COVID-19 a hoax to make Trump look bad, on the center right calling it overblown, exaggerated, just like the flu, saying things like, well, if Trump doesn't worry about it, I don't worry about it, and saying things, making the lives versus livelihoods argument that says, well, I got to keep working, people got to work. Well, people only really have to work because, I mean, people shouldn't, what am I trying to say? I like work. I work all the damn time, so I get it. But that is a social construct, this idea that we're obligated to work all the time, that our value as human beings is derived from our work, that we are what we do, that we are how much we make. This is that our identity is that of a worker, right? This is a neoliberal social construct. And if we had a welfare state with a safety net that could catch people when they fell, then we would have a lot less of this need to keep working, because people right now, they've got to go back to their jobs. They're going to put their health on the line and the health of their families on the line to go back to their jobs, to get a paycheck, because they've got to pay rent, they've got to pay health insurance, they've got to put food on the table, because they're living hand to mouth, because half of the people in this country you know, can't save $400 or $1,000. I mean, that is how check to check, month to month, hand to mouth, we're getting by in this country, the richest country in the world. And so we've got to keep working through it. We even have to keep working if we get it. We got to pretend we're not even sick with COVID-19 if we get it, and we show up to work anyway and get everybody else sick and feel really shitty about it and can't sleep at night, but we got to do it because we got to pay rent. But if we had a government, a welfare state that could collect revenue and spend that revenue to protect its people, then we wouldn't have to do that. We would do what countries in Western Europe have done and pay companies to keep people on the payroll even though the company's closed, even though the offices are closed. Denmark is paying companies to 90% of all of their salary costs until such time as they're able to reopen, right? So if we had a safety net to do that sort of thing, we wouldn't have to go back to work and put ourselves and our families and our friends and our coworkers at risk. So let's look at the politicization of COVID-19 denial or COVID-19 lack of concern. And so these are all data compiled by the New York Times, the failing New York Times, that show you cases and then in some cases death rates in different states. And so what you're looking at here, look at just the red line, the dark red line, and on the left you're looking at Florida, on the right you're looking at Texas. So these are places that are red, deeply Republican. They're Republican strongholds and they're run by Republicans. And you can see in both cases that COVID-19 rates have not fallen off. That curve hasn't rounded. We're looking for a rounded curve, right? An inverted U, a curve where the deaths spike, but then they start dropping off. And in Florida, we see this radical spike in early April, and then we do see it dropping off. But then as Florida begins to open up again in mid-May, we see a dramatic uptick in cases such that they're right back to where they were in early April. And they've gained no ground at all. And Texas is actually even worse if you look at it over time. Texas, its rate of new cases today is much higher than it was in early April. It continues to climb. It gets worse and worse. And these are places where they have taken fewer precautions, they've taken the safety measures less seriously, and they've implemented stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing for much shorter periods of time and with much less faith and rigor. But you can see, if you live in Florida or you live in Texas, you can see these graphs, and yet it doesn't seem to have an appreciable effect on behavior. So let's look, for example, at Alabama, which is a Republican stronghold. It has had cases rise pretty dramatically in the month of May, as you can see, and then in June they start to dip a little bit, or actually quite a bit, to be fair to them, but it's still much higher than it was in early April when things got started in earnest. If we look at Tennessee, also a red state, we see the same pattern. Things steadily trending upward rather than rounding off. Now, death rates in both of these places look different. The trend in Alabama is actually, it's trending down since mid-May in terms of deaths, so up with cases but down with deaths, which is good. And in Tennessee, plateaued, although a very volatile plateau, I guess. If we look at South Carolina, which is a Republican state and also one of the states that was the first and most forceful to repeal stay-at-home orders, to reopen, as it were, you see that South Carolina had a huge spike in cases in early April, just like pretty much every state did. And then it plateaued for the month of April and the month of May, and then started climbing dramatically in the month of June. So if my memory serves, South Carolina reopened mid-May. And so maybe even early May. And so we're seeing a 2-week lag between the time when a place reopens and then when the rise in cases starts to kick in. If we look at Mississippi, also a deep red state, you can see that just like everywhere else, in April, cases start to go up. They continue to go up. In the second half of May, they plateau. And then in the latter part of May into June, they go up again, declining also a little bit in early June, but still way ahead, way above where they were in April. So these are all, these are all Republican states. And I want to be clear that I am not throwing Republicans under the bus. I love Republicans. I literally love them. Many of the people that I love, many of my family are Republicans. I'm sympathetic to diversity in all of its forms, including ideological and political diversity. So this is not a Republican hit job that I'm performing here. This is not partisan hackery. I'm not trying to alienate any right-leaning students in my class that are hearing this at all. I am merely pointing out that the science denial on the right is costing lives. Now, what I have not done is I have not said that is an unequivocal bad. I haven't passed judgment on anybody that has wanted to reopen. Instead, what I'm doing is I'm simply pointing out that the act of reopening is deadly. Not that reopening isn't a net good, but that it kills people. That's all I'm wanting to point out here. So, so we look at Mississippi. Let's look at Georgia. Georgia's a weird case, actually. Georgia was the famous case. It was the first state that reopened, and it was one of the last states to close. And you would expect Georgia to look just like Alabama, just like Mississippi, just like Tennessee, just like South Carolina, and have that, you know, dramatic spike in late May, early June. In fact, they don't. Georgia has kept steady, and maybe the trend line has even very marginally gone down over the months of May and June, despite the fact that they've been reopened. So Georgia is an anomaly. It's a weird case. We're not exactly sure what it is in Georgia that is keeping that case rate from spiking, but there it is. And now let's look. Let's move from red to blue. Let's blue it out a little bit. Let's blue it up. Blue time. Bluebity. New Jersey, New York, the two famous cases, right? New York, New Jersey and New York were the two states of the United States of America with the highest number of cases across the country, per capita or gross numbers of cases highest. They were also early and dogged implementers of lockdowns or stay at home and quarantine and social distance and all the stuff that we've been doing. And so you can see the first graph here on the top left is cases in New Jersey. Late March, so they were actually much earlier to the spike. You know, we saw in a lot of these red states in the South that the spike started in early April. You can see here the spike in New Jersey started in mid-March, so a few weeks ahead. And it is a very precipitous spike. And then it plateaus. So by mid-April, it's by even early April, it's plateaued, and it plateaus until, maybe late April, and then it starts to go down, and it goes way down. And so this New Jersey looks like that hump that we want to see, right? It looks like that inverted U that we want to see. And if you look at reported cases in New York, you can see the same exact thing. Cases begin to spike in mid-March. They start to go down a month later by mid-April, and they're down much farther by early June. So that's what what blue states look like. Now this is, to be clear, this is simplistic, what I am relaying to you. Red state, blue state, spiky curve, rounded curve, right? This is simplistic. There is an infinitely complex set of factors that goes into explaining these different trends. And so I do not mean to stylize this, simplify it, what have you, but it remains the case. The data bear it out that states that were more draconian, if you will, more authoritarian, and earlier had and continue to have better success with keeping the cases down. Now, I can't tell you with these data what that means for their respective economies. And so maybe the trade-offs are real on some level, but I can tell you what it looks like in terms of the number of cases. So let's look at California, which is like Georgia, a weird case that I can't explain. California, super blue, the bluest, and really early to implement the safety protocols, and there has been no diminishment in their number of cases. It's continued to go up even into the month of June. I can't explain that. Maybe it's just because it's like too beautiful in California to stay inside. I don't know. I'm making this up. Maybe because people are lying about not going to the beach. I don't know. I don't know what it could be. It's super weird, but that's what it is. But then, take heart, my fellow Illinoisans, because Illinois, its curve has that nice round shape that we want. The one that, it looks like New Jersey, it looks like New York. So we started spiking in mid-March and continued to spike up until about mid-May. And in mid-May, we start to drop off. And we're not quite where New York is, not even where New Jersey is yet in terms of being, in terms of falling numbers, but we are clearly headed in the right direction as long as we don't give up, right? I mean, there's a lot of people out right now. There's a lot of people doing things right now, Memorial Day, and protesting police brutality and systemic racism, which is a very, very productive way to spend some time. There are a lot of people in stores, a lot of people are starting to get life kind of going again. And it remains to be seen what that's going to do, right? And then in August, all of our universities open back up again. So in Bloomington Normal, we go from being a town of about 130,000 people to being a town of about 150,000 people. And they're all young people. It's y'all. I don't know if you know, I'm talking about you. And you're at libraries in the Bone and the Rec, doing your thing, at a party, at the lodge, whatever. And, outbreak, likely. What I'm saying here is the state of Illinois looks good right now, but we're not safe yet. We don't have a handle on this yet. We're headed in the right direction, but we ain't there. And so we could very easily see this trend reverse itself as we begin to relax our stay at home and social distancing and quarantining and all that business. All right. Are you still with me? Have you made it this far? If you have, shout out to you. You don't have anything better to do. So the other piece that we read for today from the Washington Post is a deep dive into the astroturfing that underlies the anti-lockdown, anti-masking protests that we saw. So it is common, the common discourse, the common rhetoric, I should say, in the media is that these are spontaneous acts of democratic expression, that these are regular people who are frustrated and angry and have organically come together to express to exercise their right to free speech. And that is not altogether wrong, but it misses the very real piece that is the role of billionaire right-wing funding networks that have been instrumental in funding and logistically supporting and organizing protests in places like Michigan, in places like Wisconsin, in places like Illinois, against stay-at-home orders, against masking, and so on and so forth. So there's this organization that the Washington Post article talks about called the Convention of States. And this is an organization, it's a network that has its hands in a bunch of other organizations, think tanks and other political lobbying groups and so on and so forth, that has worked to facilitate communication between right-wing groups in different places so that the protests look coordinated, and this organization that's doing this has funding from Republican mega donors and members, active members of the Trump administration. Ben Carson, among others, are affiliates of this organization, Convention of States. So the point that I want to make is that there's a connection between the dark money behind science denial, whether it's climate change denial or COVID denial, and the dark money behind anti-science protesting. So these two things work together, and things that appear to be organic and spontaneous grassroots uprisings are also in large part astroturfing. And astroturfing, if you're not familiar with that phrase, is a phrase to describe, or is a word to describe a top-down, secretly funded and backed movement that is designed to look grassroots, hence astroturf, fake plastic grass, you know? Okay. So why do, in the face of literal piling up corpses, why do we still say, if Trump's not worried, I'm not worried? can't make me wear a mask, um, or why do we say, it's no big deal, it's just the flu. They're making a mountain out of a molehill. We see the bodies, and we still say this. Likewise, with climate change, we see the change, right? I mean, we see the number and intensity of storms and droughts and floods. You ask any farmer, and I'm sure people in this class right now come from rural parts of the state and either have families that farm or farm themselves or have neighbors that farm. I mean, Illinois, we grow a lot of corn and a lot of soy, and so if you ask folks that are connected to agriculture, that are connected to really any kind of primary commodity production that work outside, they'll tell you that it's different. The climate, the weather, the seasons, the precipitation is different now than it was 40 years ago. So we can observe, just like we can observe the piles of bodies, we can observe the changes to our climate that are taking place. Albeit they happen, as I said earlier, at very different time scales. And yet many of us are willfully ignorant. Many of us choose to deny that they exist. And it's not entirely clear why, although obviously, this process of casting doubt on scientific consensus that is put together, orchestrated by big money, most of which is affiliated with the petroleum industry, at least in the case of climate change, that's very effective, that sowing of doubt. But then there are other sort of psychological rationale as well. So, and one of which is described in the piece we read for today as solution aversion, which basically says, when I think of what the costs to me would be of doing what is necessary to avoid becoming infected by COVID or contributing to climate change, those costs are so massive that I'm going to find some way to convince myself that I don't need to undertake them. So, for example, if I want to keep myself safe from COVID, and I live paycheck to paycheck, as half of America does, I'm going to go to work. And if I'm going to work, I'm going to tell myself that this is just the flu. And if I tell myself that it's just the flu, and if I hear my president telling me that this isn't a big deal, my own president modeling behavior of not wearing masks in public, I'm going to choose to not wear a mask in public. I'm going to convince myself that this isn't a threat because I don't have the freedom to address the threat to myself. So that's the idea of solution aversion. So the reading today, and the reading that we will do also on Thursday in particular, asks about the way that COVID, this experience that we've all had together, has changed us in terms of the way we think, the way we see ourselves, and the way we envision the future. And I've read and shared with you lots and lots of hopeful takes over the past several weeks that suggest that COVID will make us better, more honest, more collectively minded, more resilient. I don't personally share that optimism, to be honest with you, but I certainly hope that it's true. And that I certainly hope, because COVID is a very serious threat. Climate change is an existential threat. COVID will not kill everybody on the planet. COVID will only kill 5 to 7% of us, maximum. Even if we did nothing, that's the percentage of us it would kill. Maybe more than that, but not much. But climate change, that's going to burn our faces off. Every single one. All of our faces just melting right off of our bodies. It's going to be terrible, you know? We'll be running around with no faces. We won't have any water. It's going to really, it's going to be awful. So is this collective exercise that we've undertaken, the whole world staying at home for 3 months, are we going to be able to replicate that on the scale that we would need to stave off climate change? Food for thought.